Imagine a man who has everything: power, billions, and a heart made of cold, calculated logic, until one rainy night at the Kingswell gates changes the course of his life forever. What Dorian Kingswell doesn't know as he kneels in the mud to help a frail, homeless woman is that he isn't just performing an act of charity. He is inviting a 15-year-old ghost into his home. When his wife, Evadne, sees the woman in the foyer, the glass in her hand won't be the only thing that shatters. You are about to witness a story of betrayal, hidden identities, and a justice 15 years in the making. Why did this woman vanish? And what dark secret is the Ravenswood family hiding in the shadows? Stick around until the very end, because the final transformation of this billionaire will leave you breathless. If you love high-stakes drama where the powerful finally face the truth, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a single chapter of this cinematic journey. The hunt for the truth starts right now. The rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the Maybach, a rhythmic drumming that usually lulled Dorian Kingswell into a state of cold, analytical focus. He was mid-sentence, dictating a memo that would likely dissolve a mid-sized competitor by Monday morning, when the car lurched to a violent, shuddering halt. Outside the iron gates of the Kingswell estate, a heap of sodden rags lay motionless in the gutter. "Sir, it's just a transient." His head of security, Marcus, crackled over the intercom, his voice devoid of empathy. "The perimeter team is already moving to clear the obstruction. We'll have the gates open in 30 seconds. Dorian looked out the window. Through the torrential downpour, he saw the security team approaching with the mechanical efficiency of men paid to see people as problems to be solved. They reached for the woman's arms, their grip firm and dismissive. But then, Dorian saw her face. A mask of exhaustion and weathered skin, eyes clouded not with malice, but with a terrifyingly familiar hollow of despair. A glitch occurred in Dorian's calculated world. Without a word to his driver, he threw open the door. The luxury of the climate-controlled cabin was instantly replaced by the roar of the storm and the bite of the wind. "Sir, get back in the vehicle," Marcus shouted, his hand hovering near his holster as he rushed forward to shield his employer. Dorian ignored him, stepping directly into the rising water of the gutter. His bespoke navy suit, worth more than most people earned in a year, was ruined within seconds, but he didn't care. He brushed past his stunned guards, his presence commanding a sudden, uneasy silence among the men. He knelt in the mud, his knees sinking into the grit. Up close, the woman looked even more fragile, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. She clutched a black plastic bag to her chest as if it contained the crown jewels. "You're hurting her," Dorian said, his voice low and dangerous, directed at the guard still holding her shoulder. The man instantly recoiled. Dorian reached out, his well-groomed hands a stark contrast to the grime on Zulika's coat. I didn't mean to stop," Zulika whispered, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "The lights, they were so bright." She looked at him, and for a split second, the fog in her eyes cleared, replaced by a flash of recognition so sharp it made Dorian's heart stutter. She didn't look at him like a billionaire. She looked at him like a man who was supposed to be a savior. "Enough," Dorian commanded, sliding his arm behind her frail back to support her. "She's coming inside." "Sir, with all due respect, that is a massive breach of protocol," Marcus protested, stepping into Dorian's path. "We haven't vetted her. This could be a setup." Dorian stood, lifting the woman with an effortless strength that surprised even him. He stared at his head of security with a gaze that had frozen boardrooms solid. "This is my home, Marcus, and today the protocol is mercy." He began the long walk toward the mahogany doors, shielding Zulika from the wind with his own body. Behind him, the security team stood frozen in the rain, watching as the cold king of tech carried a beggar into his sanctuary, unaware that the woman in his arms was about to set his entire world on fire. The massive mahogany doors swung open, exhaling a draft of climate-controlled cedar and expensive lilies into the storm. Dorian stepped onto the heated marble of the foyer, his boots leaving a trail of muddy water across the pristine, diamond-patterned floor. In his arms, Zulika Thorne felt lighter than a child, her breathing a frantic, shallow whistle that seemed to vibrate against his chest. The opulence of the entryway, the sweeping twin staircases, the baccarat chandelier casting fractured light across the walls, felt suddenly garish in the face of her quiet, trembling terror. As Dorian lowered her onto a velvet-upholstered bench, the house staff appeared as if from the shadows, their professional masks slipping into expressions of naked judgment. Mrs. Higgins, the head housekeeper who prided herself on a manner that looked like a museum, stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes flicked from Dorian's ruined suit to the grime-stained coat Zulika wore, her lips thinning into a line of pure distaste. "Sir," she began, her voice brittle with a forced politeness that couldn't hide her revulsion. "Shall I call the authorities to collect her? The carpets will be quite difficult to salvage." Zulika's hand flew to her beanie, pulling it lower as if she could disappear into the fabric. She shrank back into the velvet, her weathered skin pale and translucent under the unforgiving glow of the chandelier. Her eyes darted toward the exit, the familiar cold of the rain appearing safer to her than the silent, biting condemnation of the people in this room. She clutched her plastic bag tighter, the crinkling sound echoing like a gunshot in the vaulted space. "You will call no one, Mrs. Higgins?" Dorian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low frequency that silenced the room. He didn't look up, his focus entirely on the woman who looked like she was waiting for a blow to fall. "You will, however, bring warm blankets, a basin of heated water, and the best tea in this house. Now." The staff scattered like dry leaves in a gale, their whispers trailing behind them as they retreated into the kitchen wing. Dorian knelt before Zulika again, ignoring the way his own knees protested against the hard stone. "No one is going to hurt you here," he whispered, reaching out to steady her shaking hands. Zulika looked at him, her gaze wandering over the grand architecture of the foyer, as if she were trapped in a dream she didn't deserve. "This place," she rasped, her voice catching in her throat. "It's too bright. It's too loud." She looked at the polished floor and saw her own reflection, a ghost of a woman she no longer recognized. Just as the warmth of the foyer began to seep into her bones, a sharp click of heels echoed from the top of the grand staircase. Evadne Ravenswood Kingswell stood at the railing, her beige blouse glowing in the soft light, looking down at the scene below with an expression of mild confusion that rapidly curdled into shock. She descended the stairs slowly, her hand trailing along the gold-leafed banister. "Dorian? What on earth is happening?" she asked, her voice light and melodic until she reached the final step. She stopped 3 feet away, her eyes landing on the elderly woman huddled on her furniture. The air in the foyer seemed to thin, turning electric and cold. Evadne's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening until they were pools of absolute disbelief. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and final. Behind her perfectly manicured fingers, a small, choked gasp escaped her throat, a sound of recognition that would change the Kingswell legacy forever. If you're gripped by this mystery of a family torn apart and a billionaire's world turned upside down, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the moment the truth finally comes to light. Evadne Kingswell frozen on the final step of the grand staircase, her silhouette framed by the golden light of the baccarat chandelier. In her hand, she held a delicate crystal flute of sparkling water, the condensation blurring the clarity of the glass. Much like the lies she had lived for over a decade. Her gaze moved from Dorian's rain-soaked shoulders to the shivering figure on the velvet bench. The air in the foyer, usually scented with the neutral fragrance of wealth, suddenly felt heavy with the metallic tang of an approaching storm. As she stepped onto the marble, the rhythmic click of her heels faltered and then stopped entirely. Her eyes locked onto Zulika's weathered face, and for a heartbeat, the grand foyer of Kingswell Manor vanished. She wasn't a socialite in a beige blouse anymore. She was a terrified girl watching her world crumble 15 years ago. The woman before her was a map of hardship, her skin etched with the cruelty of the streets, but the shape of her eyes and the specific, trembling way she clutched her plastic bag were unmistakable. "Dorian!" Evadne's voice was a ghost of itself, a fragile thread that threatened to snap. She took one more step, her vision tunneling until the only thing that existed was the elderly woman's face. What have you done? Dorian stood, his hand still hovering protectively near Zulika. She was at the gates, Evadne. She has nowhere to go. Zulika looked up then, her clouded eyes meeting Evadne's bright, tear-filled ones. A small, broken sound escaped the elderly woman's throat. Not a word, but a whimpering recognition that sliced through the professional silence of the room. At that sound, the crystal flute slipped from Evadne's nerveless fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, melodic explosion, shattering into 1,000 jagged diamonds that skittered across the floor. Mother! The word was a sob, ripped from a place in Evadne's soul that she had kept boarded up since she was 20 years old. She collapsed to her knees, heedless of the glass shards surrounding her. Mama, is it really you? Dorian felt the floor shift beneath him. He had known this woman was important, but the word mother hit him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at Zulika, then back to his wife, who was reaching out with trembling fingers to touch the weathered skin of the woman he had found in the gutter. The shock in the room was absolute. Even the judgmental whispers of the staff in the hallway died into a tomb-like silence. Zulika's frail hand reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from Evadne's face. Little bird? She whispered, using a childhood nickname that hadn't been spoken in 15 years. The realization crashed over Dorian like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a homeless woman, and this wasn't just a random act of kindness. He had brought home a woman who was supposed to be dead, a woman whose passing had been the foundation of the Ravenswood inheritance. As Evadne pulled her mother into a desperate, weeping embrace, Dorian looked toward the darkened windows of the estate. He realized then that by opening his door to a stranger, he had inadvertently declared war on the very family he had married into. The 15-year-old lie was breathing in his foyer, and the people who had buried her were not going to let her stay alive for long. The silence in the foyer was no longer empty. It was heavy, suffocating under the weight of a decade and a half of lies. Dorian stood like a sentinel over the two women, watching as his wife's expensive beige blouse soaked up the grime from her mother's tattered coat. The staff had retreated into the shadows, sensing that the air in the manor had turned toxic with a secret far larger than a ruined carpet. Zulika's eyes, once clouded by the fog of the streets, seemed to sharpen as she felt the warmth of her daughter's skin. It was a terrifying clarity, the kind that comes just before a storm breaks. They told me you were gone, Mama, Evadne sobbed, her forehead resting against Zulika's shoulder. A car accident in Switzerland. They showed me the reports. They showed me a grave. Zulika's hands, gnarled and trembling, moved to cup Evadne's face. The only thing they buried that night was the truth. My little bird, she rasped, her voice sounding like a ghost trying to remember how to speak. She looked up at Dorian, her gaze steadying as if she were finally seeing the man who had pulled her from the gutter. It wasn't a crash. It was a contract. Dorian felt a chill that the manor's advanced heating system couldn't touch. He had heard rumors of the Ravenswood family's methodical and patient nature when it came to protecting their empire, but this was a different level of depravity. He pulled a chair closer, gently guiding both women to sit as the ghost from the past began to unravel the threads of a 15-year-old betrayal. Your father, he didn't just want the Ravenswood fortune. He wanted the Thorne inheritance. Zulika began, her eyes distant, fixed on a memory that clearly still haunted her. I found the ledgers, the fraudulent deals, the offshore accounts he used to siphon the legacy our family built. I confronted him on a night just like this, cold, rainy, and heartless. She shivered, clutching the warm blanket Dorian had draped over her. I thought my love would be enough to change him. I was a fool. He didn't see a wife. He saw a witness to be eliminated. She described a night of terror that began with a screaming warning in their private dining room. She wasn't killed, but she was discarded. Her husband had used his vast influence to strip her of her identity, her money, and her sanity. He had threatened that if she ever approached Evadne, he would ensure the girl met a far worse fate. I became a shadow to keep you safe, Zulika whispered, a single tear carving a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. I watched you from the street corners. I saw your wedding photos in the discarded newspapers. I was a beggar at your gates, waiting for the courage to either die or be seen. Dorian tightened his jaw, the coldness that usually defined him cracking to reveal a simmering, protective rage. He realized now that his marriage to Evadne had been built on a foundation of blood and theft. The circle of traitors wasn't just in his business. It was in his own family tree. The woman in front of him wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was a victim of a massive conspiracy orchestrated by the man Dorian called his father-in-law. As Zulika finished her tale, the weight of the revelation settled over them like a shroud. The test run of her life on the streets was over. The hunt for justice had officially begun. Dorian looked at his wife's shattered expression and then at the frail woman who had survived the impossible. He knew that by keeping her here, he was no longer just a billionaire. He was an unlikely ally in a war that would dismantle everything the Ravenswoods had built. The air in the Grand Library felt like it had been sucked out of the room, leaving behind a cold, pressurized silence that made Evadne's ears ring. She stood before the massive oak desk where her father, the patriarch of the Ravenswood Empire, had often sat to discuss legacy and honor. Every childhood memory she held dear, the bedtime stories, the expensive gifts, the comfort he offered after her mother's accident, now felt like a jagged piece of a massive conspiracy designed to dismantle the truth. She looked at her hands and saw they were shaking, not from the cold of the rain still clinging to her husband's coat, but from a freight train of realizations that threatened to derail her entire identity. Dorian stood by the fireplace, his silhouette tall and imposing, yet his usual cold, untouchable nature had shifted into something protective and urgent. He watched his wife realize that the man she had loved and trusted was actually a methodical and patient predator who had orchestrated a takeover of her mother's inheritance. The ghost from the past was no longer a metaphor. Zulika was resting in the guest wing, a living testament to a $3 million betrayal that had started 15 years ago. He told me the car went over the cliff in the Alps, Evadne whispered, her voice cracking as she leaned against the mahogany bookshelves. He cried at the funeral, Dorian. He held me while they lowered an empty casket into the ground. The tone of her voice was no longer that of a polished socialite. It was the raw, gritty sound of a woman whose emotional armor had finally cracked. She realized her father hadn't just faked a death. He had faked a life, building his current power on the bones of a woman he had deemed powerless. Dorian walked over and placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. He didn't just lie about the death, Evadne. He used the chaos to consolidate the Thorne family holdings into the Ravenswood accounts. He knew this revelation would be the inciting incident for a war within their inner circle. The stakes were no longer just about money or business. They were about a hope for redemption and the survival of the woman they had just rescued from the streets. Evadne looked up, her eyes burning with a new, dangerous clarity. The Ravenswood secret wasn't a burden she had to carry anymore. It was a weapon. She understood now that her father's reliance on fear and power had left him with a critical flaw. He assumed the people he discarded would stay broken. As she gripped Dorian's hand, the atmosphere in the room shifted from grief to an urgent tactical resolve. The cleaning house had begun, and before the night was over, every lie her father had ever told would be dragged into the unforgiving light of the Kingswell foyer. The rain had slowed to a treacherous, rhythmic drizzle, but the atmosphere inside the Kingswell Manor remained thick with the weight of Zulika's revelation. Dorian stood by the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, his reflection ghost-like against the darkened glass. He was no longer just a billionaire managing an empire. He was a man who had survived through extreme paranoia and security, and his instincts were screaming that the cleaning house had already begun. A flicker of movement at the edge of the estate caught his eye. Down by the towering iron gates where he had found Zulika only hours ago, a sleek, black sedan sat idling in the shadows, its headlights extinguished. It didn't belong to his security detail, and it wasn't a guest expected at this hour. The vehicle sat motionless, a silent, predatory observer in the dark. Dorian felt a freight train of realizations hitting him. The Ravenswoods were not just patient. They were already moving to protect their $3 million betrayal. "Marcus," Dorian said into his comms, his voice dropping to that cold, dangerous frequency. "The black sedan at the south gate. I want a plate, a thermal scan, and I want our perimeter tripled. Now." He turned to see Evadne standing in the doorway, her face pale. She had spent the last hour trying to reconcile the cold, untouchable father she knew with the man who had discarded her mother like a witness to be eliminated. Seeing the tension in Dorian's shoulders, she walked to the window. Her breath hitched as she saw the dark shape at the gate. The threat was no longer a future possibility. The ghost of the past had drawn the hunters to their door. "They know, don't they?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "They know she's not on the streets anymore," Dorian replied, his gaze never leaving the car. He realized that by bringing Zulika inside, he had stepped into a high-level underworld war. The stakes were absolute. If they failed to protect the frail woman resting upstairs, they would lose more than just a legacy. They would lose the only hope for redemption in a family built on a circle of traitors. As if sensing his gaze, the black sedan's engine roared to life, the red glow of its taillights bleeding into the mist like an open wound. It didn't speed away. It crawled slowly along the perimeter fence, a methodical reminder that the Kingswell Manor was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. The hunt had officially begun, and Dorian knew that to survive the night, he would have to become as patient and ruthless as the enemies at his gates. The steam from the heated basin rose in soft, ivory plumes, softening the sharp, cinematic edges of the guest suite. Evadne sat on a low ottoman, her movements shedding the rigid poise of a billionaire's wife for something far more ancient and primal. She took Zulika's hand, a hand that was a map of 15 years of survival, etched with the grit of the streets and the scars of a ghost who had been forced into the shadows. With a soft cloth and the patience of a daughter reclaiming a lost part of her soul, Evadne began to wash away the layers of dust and hardship. The water in the porcelain basin clouded quickly, a dark swirl of the weathered life Zulika had been forced to lead. "I used to think about your hands when I was a little girl," Evadne whispered, her voice thick with an emotional arc that was finally bending toward healing. "How they felt when you'd tuck me in. I never thought I'd be the one holding yours while you trembled." As the grime vanished, it revealed the pale, delicate skin underneath. The skin of a woman who had once belonged to a world of high-stakes influence before she was deemed powerless and discarded. Zulika watched her daughter's head bowed in devotion, her own coldness and fear cracking under the weight of this unexpected mercy. The act of being cleaned was more than just physical. It was a restoration of dignity that the Ravenswood conspiracy had tried to strip away forever. For 15 years, she had been a beggar at the gates. But in this quiet, tender moment, the thin, shivering woman was being woven back into the tapestry of a family. The silence in the room was no longer heavy with betrayal, but light with the hope for redemption that Dorian had inadvertently invited into his kingdom. When the last of the street's reminders had been rinsed away, Evadne patted her mother's hands dry with a silk towel, her touch a silent vow that the ghost would never have to hide again. Zulika looked at her clean, trembling fingers and then at the daughter who had finally listened to the woman everyone else had forgotten. It was a small, quiet victory in a world of massive arms shipments and underworld wars, a reminder that the strongest power wasn't found in a $3 million deal, but in the simple, heartbreaking courage of a child coming home. The peace within the guest suite was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden, oppressive shift in the manor's energy. Downstairs, the heavy mahogany doors didn't just open. They were thrown wide, hitting the stone walls with a hollow boom that echoed up the twin staircases like a rhythmic warning. Dorian stood at the landing, his face a mask of cold, untouchable resolve as he watched his father-in-law, Silas Ravenswood, stride into the foyer. Silas didn't arrive alone. He was flanked by 4 men in charcoal suits, their posture reflecting a methodical and patient aggression that signaled the cleaning house had reached the inner circle. Silas looked up, his eyes scanning the opulent marble and gold leaf with the entitlement of a man who believed every kingdom was eventually his to dismantle. "Dorian," he called out, his voice a gritty, low frequency that lacked any trace of familial warmth. "I believe you've picked up something that belongs to me. A bit of trash from the gates that has caused a massive conspiracy of confusion in my household." Dorian descended the stairs slowly, each step a calculated move in a high-stakes life-or-death situation. "What I found at my gates wasn't trash, Silas. It was the truth you buried 15 years ago," Dorian replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous level that made the security team shift uneasily. The air in the foyer turned electric, the atmosphere shifting rapidly from a suspenseful mystery to an urgent tactical thriller. From the shadows of the upper hallway, Evadne appeared, her hands still damp from the water she had used to restore her mother's dignity. Seeing her father, the man she once looked to for wisdom and power, standing there with a circle of traitors made her emotional armor finally shatter. "You told me she was dead," she whispered, her voice trembling with a raw, gritty pain. "You made me mourn a ghost while you sat on her inheritance." Silas didn't flinch. His flaw was an absolute reliance on fear and the belief that the powerless could be easily eliminated. "I did what was necessary to protect the Ravenswood legacy, Evadne. And now, I am here to reclaim my wife and end this test run of a reunion." He gestured to his men, who began to move toward the stairs, their intent clear. They were going on the offensive to reclaim Zulika by force. Dorian stepped in front of the staircase, his silhouette blocking their path. He was no longer just a billionaire. He was an unlikely ally in a war for redemption. "She stays here, Silas. And if you want to reclaim anything, you'll have to go through the man who knows exactly how much your silence is worth." The threat was no longer a future possibility. The battle for Pier 17 and the Kingswell legacy had officially begun right there on the marble floor. If you've been moved by this journey of a family reclaimed and a billionaire's transformation, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories where justice finally wins. The air in the foyer was a pressurized chamber of old money and new fury. Silas Ravenswood stood at the center of the marble floor, his presence a methodical and patient reminder of the power he had used to dismantle a woman's life 15 years ago. But as his men took a collective step toward the stairs, Dorian Kingswell didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for his phone. With a single, sharp swipe, the cold king of tech activated a freight train of digital evidence he had been quietly compiling since Zulika first whispered her truth. "You think your power comes from the silence of the streets, Silas?" Dorian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, cinematic low. "But my power comes from the data you thought you deleted." Suddenly, the massive monitors in the foyer, usually reserved for displaying art or market tickers, flickered to life. Grainy surveillance footage from a ghost of a night 15 years ago filled the room, showing a much younger Silas forcing a terrified Zulika into an unmarked car near the Pier 17 docks. Alongside the video, bank ledgers scrolled by in a blur of red, detailing the $3 million betrayal and the systematic siphoning of the Thorne inheritance into Ravenswood accounts. The circle of traitors Silas had brought with him hesitated, their eyes darting from their boss to the undeniable proof of his crimes. The unlikely ally Dorian had become was no longer just protecting a guest. He was dismantling an empire in real time. Silas's face turned a bruised shade of purple, his reliance on fear crumbling as he realized the cleaning house had finally reached his own doorstep. Evadne descended the final steps, her hand firmly entwined with her mother's. She didn't look like a socialite anymore. She looked like a woman who had found her hope for redemption in the wreckage of a lie. "It's over, Father," she said, her voice steady and cold. "The police are already at the gates. The same gates where you left her to die." As the distant wail of sirens cut through the rhythmic rain, Dorian stepped forward, placing himself between the Ravenswoods and the woman he had rescued. He had spent his life choosing status and optics, but as he looked at the tears of joy on Zulika's weathered face, he knew he had finally chosen something better: family. The final outcome wasn't just a legal victory. It was a total transformation of the Kingswell legacy. The kind-hearted billionaire had started the night by helping a stranger, and he ended it by bringing a mother home and ensuring that, for the first time in 15 years, justice was finally served.